welcome everyone to our session today where we will be looking at inclusion during COVID. I'm Dr. Tanisha Nelson, and in our session, we'll be having 4 presentations, and each presentation will last for about 15 minutes. And we will be taking questions at the end of all of the presentations. So we ask you to wait for that. So I now invite Elizabeth and Helen to start us off with their presentations.
Apologies, Tanisha, this is taking some time. Helen, would you like to share them?
Yes, I'll just have a look.
It's quite complicated compared to ESA.
Yes. I'm just trying to find. Just bear with. Okay, I'll try this. Okay. Okay, can you see that, Liz?
No, I can't. I've got it.
Right, okay.
Whether I can read it at that size is another matter, but I think I know the content, so shall we crack on? Or
Okay.
Can you get back to the beginning, Helen?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Elizabeth Jane Doan, and along with Helen Nola, we'll be talking about planning for COVID-19 and future crises, inclusion and strategic leadership. Yeah. I can't enlarge my screen, I'm sorry, so if this seems a little halting, but we're talking about strategic leadership in future crises. Okay, so just a little about the context. You've missed a slide, Helen. This was part of a larger research project, an ongoing research project comprising several studies. And our particular emphasis has been exclusion with reference to off-rolling or illegal exclusionary practices. The unique context of the event, of the research, I beg your pardon, and I think most people know that schools in England, if there are viewers from outside of England, were locked down, but there was partial reopening for children classified as vulnerable, subject to risk assessments undertaken by schools and local authorities. So we were very aware through our involvement in the NASENCO, an award would be SENCOs, of the pressures that SENCOs were under in schools in the immediate aftermath of lockdown. Nevertheless, you know, we ended up with disappointingly small samples, particularly on the quantitative part of the project, where were hoping for statistical validity, but that wasn't achieved. But nevertheless, we did think that the research generated or potentially would generate some interesting findings or insights. And of course, it raised issues around research design for us, which we'd already begun pursuing in an earlier study on senior leader perspectives on off-rolling, where we, just to give you a heads up on our theoretical framework for that project, and most of these studies, although that's changing, we're moving slightly towards feminist theorizing. We were particularly interested in Foucault's art of invisibility, because I think in a neoliberal performative context, that is very relevant. And I'm this is a reference to Ball's impression management. Next slide, please. Oh, God. Yeah, there is a substantial literature on SENCO, the SENCO role. It's notably very onerous, demanding. We're also, it's widely known that a certain proportion, often unspecified, of SENCOs are not members of senior leadership teams in schools, which is, raises a sort of contradiction between the SEND Code of Practice, which is statutory guidance for SENCOs, which demands them to operate at whole school and therefore a strategic level. So there is that tension there. It can also be noted that only a small proportion, a very small proportion, in fact, of vulnerable children entitled to attend schools during lockdown did so. Yeah. Can you move to the next slide, Helen? I'm struggling with that text. So our research questions were, how have SENCOs been involved in planning for off-site and on-site provision for vulnerable children during lockdowns, COVID lockdown? How are SENCOs involved in senior leadership team planning about post-COVID-19 provision? And how are SENCOs working to prevent exclusion and off-rolling during COVID lockdown conditions? Next slide. Okay, this was very much, it was a very small scale and exploratory descriptive research design study. Ethics approval from the University of Plymouth, who received the award from BERA to undertake the research. The methodology was mixed, and we pursued that despite the small sample size on the survey component. Next slide, please. Okay, the qualitative component was a small sample, but these were depth semi-structured interviews. The sample was reasonably balanced with 6 teachers, a deputy head and head teacher, half and half in terms of SLT and non-SLT, and the majority had over 5 years experience as SENCOs, and there is a variety of settings. Next slide, please. Okay. We asked the question about the extent to which SENCOs were involved in general planning for teaching and learning prior to lockdown. And we found that the majority who were in senior leadership teams were involved in that. Next slide. We also asked about COVID, about the discussion of crisis planning prior to the COVID pandemic. And that was quite interesting. We found that the majority had not discussed crisis planning of any type prior to the pandemic. And when asked about being consulted in the immediate run-up to the lockdown, only 14 agreed that they'd been consulted by their senior leader or head teacher around provision immediately prior. So the interview data was, there was a contrast here between the quantitative and qualitative, in that our reading of the qualitative data was that there was no real understanding of what crisis planning entails. Okay. Yeah. There are, I have to say this, we're trying to change the narrative somewhat around SENCOs, because we do get narratives that are celebratory. It's very difficult to say anything critical because what is known about the onerous nature of the role. The long verbatim, if anyone can read it below, comes from one school where there was concern, particularly around disadvantaged students, And this describes teachers who were not sort of meant to be on site with their rota, coming in voluntarily, putting food parcels together, and for people who didn't have laptops and IT connections, they were providing material there. And this is quite interesting, given a statement I think Spielman and Ofsted have made to the press today, where that provision of food parcels is seen as somehow falling below expectations because it wasn't about education for all. But that's a bizarrely acontextualized view. These students concerned in the quotation did not have access to edutech at home. Next slide, please. I think I'll hand over to you now, Helen. This is the quantitative material.
Thanks. I'm hoping that you can hear me. So one of the things that we were interested in was looking at provision before lockdown, during lockdown and post-lockdown. So I'm just going to go through some of our findings from the sample of 31 SENCOs that completed the survey for us. And here you'll see that SENCOs generally agreed, 20 out of the 31 agreed that the pupils with special educational needs were prioritised during lockdown. But then we kind of tried to get a sense of how SENCOs were dealing with this nature of on-site and off-site provision, because obviously for the first time ever, mainstream SENCOs were having to deal with the notion of pupils with SEND potentially being home educated, something that special colleagues are very SENCOs and special education colleagues are probably quite used to. And you'll see here that there was a sense that off-site support was not reduced, whereas there was a kind of a 50-50 split with SENCOs that thought that on-site provision, their plans they'd made for on-site provision were reduced during the lockdown. One SENCO says, historically, we've never operated in that way. And what's changed since lockdown is we've developed a team around the child. So now we have one member of senior leadership team that sits over SEND, special educational needs, student support and behaviour provision, one member of SLT overseeing all of that. Key members from each of those teams meet every week and we discuss children in a different way. So that's been a real positive outcome of lockdown. And this was quite interesting to us in the sense of we thought that SENCOs were the people who perhaps sat over all of those areas. But there's definitely something worth picking up on and researching further around the kind of changes in practice and the changes in development that lockdown promoted and the extent to which that has impacted on students' experiences. SENCOs also talked about they were expecting a kind of backlash, is the word used by this participant, in trying to navigate what the changes in provision mean for children with special educational needs. And they did mention mental health difficulties. Some agreement around that the lockdown experience would impact future provision positively. And we think that there's some definite avenues to explore about SENCO's work around how they felt about these new ways of working because they didn't get a chance to think about it. There was an intensity of feeling around whether SENCOs might advise parents to continue lockdown. And again, this is something we would like to explore further because the people who responded in the survey, 25 out of the 31 said they would not be advising parents to continue home educating. And this is just interesting because it reflects Janet Goodall's work around educators having negative perceptions of parents' abilities. So I think there's some work there to explore around that relationship between SENCOs and parents. We also explored exclusion and SENCO's perceptions of exclusionary practices that might have been happening during lockdown. And while we know from other data sources that exclusions continued, full-time and permanent exclusion, the SENCOs who responded in our survey and in our interview weren't necessarily reporting that they were seeing that or experiencing it. But we did get some quite worrying data, and our emphasis is on off-rolling and unlawful exclusion. And in this data, words like when you've got difficult students, you just try to transition them on and pass the buck. I mean, it's quite a worrying thing to hear somebody report about students with special educational needs. In the data, in the survey data, only 2 participants reported knowing anything about formal exclusions during lockdown. And at interview, this was repeated with a lack of knowledge around exclusion. We would argue that that's because most people would think about that as a formal exclusion. We asked about whether we thought that lockdown was going to increase the likelihood of exclusions. But most SENCOs disagreed that would be the case. And it may well be that some schools did adopt zero exclusion policies during that first lockdown period. And again, something we would like to look at. But as we said, we know from Freedom of Information requests that students were definitely being excluded in that period of lockdown. And here's some verbatim texts around schools that are a bit more prone to off-rolling. Recently, Ofsted have kind of come into the news again with critique that they haven't been spotting these illegal practices, even though they said they would. And lots of people tended to report knowing about it or knowing about it elsewhere and not necessarily talking about it in their own contexts. So very briefly, we still want to advocate strongly for SENCOs to be members of senior leadership teams, because what we could see in the data is where people weren't member of senior leadership teams, their influence was reduced. We also think that there should be some training and mandatory expectation that SENCOs do get support around crisis management. And we strongly believe that there should be sabbaticals for SENCOs, allowing them to do further research to improve provision in crisis provision. And we'd like to say that what we noticed that our data, we think that some of the things that SENCO say to us is a result of, in England particularly, safeguarding practices and disciplinary frameworks being very separate. And we know that this isn't the case in international context. And maybe policies that are more integrated so that safeguarding procedures are kicked into place when exclusion happens might actually be a way of combating illegal and unlawful exclusion. So I'm just going to hand over to Liz for the final slide. If you can see it, sorry.
No, I can't, to be honest. Sorry, Helen, you put an earlier version on and it's just unreadable. So you read it and put.
Okay, so we found no evidence.
1 more minute because time's running out.
Final slide, yeah. So we found no evidence of strategic planning prior to COVID-19. So this was in contrast to countries which had operationalised strategic planning, maybe as a result of things like SARS. And we talked to colleagues in international settings who could give us quite clear examples of where special educational needs provision and crisis planning was done. So COVID-19 has highlighted and exacerbated familiar issues in SEND provision in English schools, including the apparent reluctance of a yet unknown proportion of SENCOs to challenge exclusionary practices. The post-pandemic period provides an opportunity to radically review educational priorities, but especially the obvious tensions between routine exclusionary practices and the right to education. And the experiences of SENCOs internationally could be illuminating to facilitate further discussions around crisis planning, which might help to mitigate against reactive firefighting, which I think we saw clearly in our data. Thanks, everybody, and apologies for the technical difficulties.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Helen. And again, we will be taking questions after all the presentations have been completed. So I now turn over to Susanna, who will take us through her presentation.
Hello, thank you very much. Just trying to share my screen if I can. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. This isn't straightforward. Let me try again. It looks like I have to change some settings, which I wasn't expecting. So if the next presenter is ready, perhaps we can do it that way. Shall we try?
The next presenter is me, so let's see if I can share my screen. Is that okay with you, Dr. Burke?
Just let me know when I'm speaking.
Okay.
All right. Good morning.
Hold on a minute. I'll get there in 1 minute. Should be good.
Yes.
All right. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm joining you from Jamaica, where it is sunny at a little bit after 10 a.m. So on March 10, 2020, Jamaica confirmed its first imported case of COVID from the UK and its first death on March 18. With COVID declared a global pandemic by the WHO on March 11, the Jamaican government immediately mobilized strategies to ensure that the nation was protected from any impending threats posed by the virus. One of these strategies was the closure of schools and moving teaching and learning online, effective March 14. So that's like 4 days, so it was quick. The closure posed a problem for teaching and learning and further exposed challenges faced by students, particularly those students from rural and marginalized communities. Now, I'm Dr. Olivine Burke, and today my colleague and I, Dr. Tanisha Nelson and Vanessa Ellis Colley, who is unavoidably absent, present our research on access to education in a time of pandemic in Jamaica. Rural and urban primary schools experience is what we will be sharing. And at this point, I want to recognize there are small grants for funding this research. Now, our presentation will cover the outline, which is presented there. Dr. Nelson will take you from introduction through to data collection, and I will continue from data collection onwards. Dr. Nelson.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Burke. So hello once again, everyone. As Dr. Burke pointed out, this study was conducted in Jamaica in the midst of the increased lockdowns brought on by COVID-19. And as she rightly said, the Ministry of Education responded to the COVID-19 challenge as it relates to the continuation of education for all our students by moving education or moving the delivery of education online. However, one of the major challenges with this move to online learning was the inherent risk to children's access to education across the island, as not every student had the basic resources to access online learning. As the Ministry of Education also pointed out, in May 2020, approximately 30% of the country's population had no internet access, and that at least 30,000 students remained unreachable despite efforts to continue teaching and learning. With that in mind, we wanted to explore the experience of students from rural and urban schools as it relates to their ability to access education during the pandemic. Specifically, our research questions were: to what extent has COVID-19 impacted access to continued education in the primary schools under investigation? We also wanted to find out how the state's interventions facilitated continued education during the COVID-19 crisis, and to what extent did the findings of the project's second qualitative phase converged with those of its quantitative phase. To answer these questions, we purposefully selected 6 schools, 1 rural and 1 urban, from each of the 3 counties of the island. The schools had several differences as it relates to student population, with the largest school having approximately 738 students enrolled, and the smallest schools with an enrollment number of about 185 students. A number of the schools were also single-story structures with just classrooms used as the demarcation between, chalkboards being used as the demarcation between each of the classrooms, while we also had schools that had multiple stories, 3 stories or 2 stories. So it was a range of schools that were included in this study. And to explore the issue of students' access to education, we used Thomas Veske's 2011 4A framework. And in this framework, attention is brought to the government's obligations to ensure that all children have access to education, and that the education which is available and accessible is good quality, or of good quality, while meeting the unique and diverse needs of all students. In essence, education should continue to be available, accessible, adaptable, and acceptable for all students. We also utilized a general systems theory to explore whether schools as open systems were able to meet their objectives given the context of COVID-19. We also paid attention to the concepts of social exclusion, inclusion, as well as inequality to understand the issues of marginalization in students' experience while they were accessing, or the lack of access that they had, while the state was providing education online during the pandemic. So we utilized the sequential mixed methods design with quantitative data collected in phase 1 and qualitative data in phase 2. The methods used were surveys for phase 1 and interviews and focus groups for phase 2. The participants of the study were the 6 principals from the 6 schools that we had identified, 36 teachers, and 108 parents across the 6 schools. Data collection was done in 2 phases. In phase 1, participants were asked to complete a survey, which was administered through SurveyMonkey. We also had to actually go out in the field as well to the communities to reach out to parents who did not have internet access for them to also complete the survey. And in the second phase, we interviewed all the principals and conducted 3 focus groups, each one, 3 for the teachers and 3 for the parents based on the different counties. And it should also be noted that we asked participants to share their experiences over 2 school terms. So the March to July of the 2019-2020 school year and the September to November period of the 2020-2021 school year. Over to you, Dr. Burke.
Okay, so data from the survey were collected and they were entered in SPSS for analysis, and we generated descriptive statistics. We used the results from the quantitative analysis to guide the developments of the interviews and focus group schedules that we use with the principals as well as teachers and parents. We use the qualitative to explore in more depth the results from the quantitative phase. Given the internet issues and the restricted movements at the time, both phases were conducted online and also face-to-face because we were aiming for inclusion because some persons didn't have internet access. The qualitative data collected were transcribed and then coded using NVivo, and the major themes formed the basis for our analysis. We further integrated the findings of both phases at the final interpretation stage, and we do that to determine how the results converged or diverged. Now on to the findings. On analyzing the data, we found 6 major themes with several sub-themes within the data. Themes in relation to research question 1, which reads, to what extent has COVID-19 impacted access to continued education in selected urban and primary schools in Jamaica? The themes are threefold: technology, devices, and learning kits. From the table, you will see that the majority of participants we spoke with indicated that they had major challenges with technology. And the technology here refers to a combination of devices, internet services, television, WhatsApp, Google Classroom, and radio for us. So we explored this finding in the focus group session. The challenges with technology, because it was the most prominent, we learned included the affordability of data and services. It also included capability to use online platform, knowledge and experience, as well as loss of income by parents, among other challenges. One parent from a school we call School A explained, parents do not have phone, internet service, or any other device to get the schoolwork at most schools. Data or service is costly, and most parents cannot afford it. We found that while parents raised challenges concerning compatibility of data for Google Meet, affordability of data and internet connections, teachers too face challenges in March to July using the online platform. One teacher stated, I was using WhatsApp to deliver lessons. That's the only thing I knew about. But after exposure to the learning management system provided by the government in training later, I tried my best to use the Google Classroom. Now, there were students, especially in the rural parishes, without online services. To reach those students, principals had to use other initiatives, such as some learning kits that were provided by the Ministry of Education, along with their own personal efforts to ensure they reach the many students that were out there as possible. And learning kits were, packages of printed material that was supplied by the government as one of the strategies. So one principal noted, we try to reach them, which are the students, through learning kits, and we have a drop-off and pick-up point on the school compound for each grade. We also ask parents who are without devices to come in and collect the packages. Teachers come in on Friday for them, and they mark them and return these activities. Additionally, my teachers and I also drop off work for students at their homes in the deeper rural areas where, it was really almost impossible to reach. In relation to question 2, which reads, how has the state intervention facilitated access during the pandemic? The participants in our study described several interventions that were put in place by government to facilitate the continued access to education. These include 1, the provision of devices. The government provided that. 2, they provided counseling sessions. And 3, they also provided training for teachers to enable them to better provide online learning and also counseling support to students. Through the voice of a teacher from one school, we heard some students get tablets from the government. And yes, the computer I use presently, I got it from the e-learning training. One parent, they complained that though the terms of agreement associated with devices provided by the government actually resulted in some students accessing online, you would wonder how so. The point is that the parents stated that the list that the government sent us with the tablets issued is one reason why so many children are without devices, because if you destroyed the device, you had to pay for it. And face it, be honest, if the government is helping us with money for food, how is it that I'm going to be able to pay for a broken tablet? We also found that although early training were provided to teachers by the state between March and July in how to use the platform, it was inadequate. Participants in all the schools felt they were unprepared and uncomfortable to deliver online. But as time progressed with the exposure to Zoom, teachers were more comfortable. A principal stated, The state also did Zoom training session with us on how we could positively introduce or conduct behavior sessions in the online setting, or what we could possibly do even though we were distance away. And this brings us to our final research question: to what extent do the results converge in the final analysis? The majority of the participants in the research agree that most students found online learning was more challenging than face-to-face, though this improved slightly in September to November after the training was received. From the focus group session, we also learned that age factored prominently in the challenges that participants experienced. The parents revealed that children in grade 1 to 3 and those with special needs, such as learning disabilities, found online learning more challenging than students in grades 4 to 6. Younger students especially appeared to perform well only when they had parental assistance. And out of that, we have suggested a few recommendations that the government should consider putting in place. One, free internet access should be provided for all. This would eliminate the difficulty with meeting the costs of data cited by parents. The state should seek to attract more support from private sector. Efforts should be made to ensure that community access points are installed as a short-term measure, while strategies are put in place to accommodate home access. And another recommendation is to increase tablet allocations to school, particularly in rural areas, and this should be free of cost to students. And we want to point out that while the distribution of devices that the government had installed in schools is commendable, students should be supplied with devices that are more sturdy and compatible to the Google Classroom. And so in concluding, the researchers, we prefer that the state should mandate a blended approach to teaching and learning in order to facilitate social equality and inclusion access to education. And this will undoubtedly support the No Child Be Left Behind, which is adopted in the Vision 2030 Jamaica Development Plan. We thank you for listening, and we will take questions whenever you are ready.
All right, so thank you very much, Dr. Burke. We will now move over to Susanna, who will take us through her presentation.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the time to change the settings in my computer, which I think should allow me to share my screen now. Okay, so just put in full view. I'm hoping everyone can see this now. So I'm going to present a study that I conducted recently with my colleague Arif Mahmood at the University of Roehampton. And we looked at parental perceptions of school closures, but also of returning to schools from the point of view of parents of children with disabilities and special educational needs in England. So the main objective of the study was to assess parental perspectives on the impact of school closures and of returning to school. And just to give you a little bit of background, there is some research already in this area. 2020 was a very prolific year in terms of research in this field. And although we know that COVID-19 rarely severely affects children in terms of the disease itself, we all agree that the impact of school closures and homeschooling is still yet to be fully seen. However, interestingly, there's been some references in the literature that there might be a silver lining to lockdowns, to the 2020 lockdowns, particularly for the most vulnerable children who, for example, may be victims of bullying in school or potentially more exposed to risky behavior when going to school. And for these, it has been said, being at home might have potentially provided temporary relief or protection, at least to some of them. In terms of the impact on children with SEND, special educational needs and disability in particular, there is some international evidence We know from a study with Indian parents of children with special needs that parents showed enhanced depression, anxiety, and stress symptoms after the outbreak compared to pre-COVID levels. A study in China shows that parents of children with autism spectrum disorders were more likely to suffer from mental health issues when compared to other parents. But research has also shown that this impact is determined by the cumulative effect of vulnerability factors. So pre-existing mental health conditions, for example, being economically underprivileged, for example. So it's more important, the impact is more evident, more apparent when there is a cumulative effect of risk factors. And we know that children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities are potentially more likely to suffer negatively from the impacts of the pandemic. We also know that within SEND, those with fewer resources are much more reliant on things like meals offered by schools, playground facilities for exercise and play, when compared to children with SEND from more affluent backgrounds. So the role of socioeconomic background here has a very big impact. In England, it has been said as well that the provision of children with SEND documented in their education, health and care plans, which are the statutory documents describing their provision and needs, has not been adapted during the pandemic. There was no time to make adjustments to the provision that was documented as statutory provision. And so little is known about children and parental health and well-being upon returning to school as well in the post-lockdown period in the autumn of 2020. So this is what we were interested in looking at. So we formulated 4 research questions. The first one was focused on parental perceptions of the impact of school closures on their children's mental and physical health. We also looked at the impact of school closures on the parents' own mental and physical health. We looked at the parents' perceptions of their experience of schools reopening after the 2020 national lockdown. And also we looked at how parental perceptions varied according to personal characteristics and demographic characteristics. So to do that, we conducted an online survey between October and December 2020 with both closed and open questions, and we conducted content analysis and statistical analysis of those responses. We had a total of 83 responses from parents of children, as you can see, from a variety of age groups, various ethnic backgrounds as well, various types of special educational needs, which reflect the national trend in England in terms of the distribution between the different types of needs, and also from different types of educational settings. Now I'm going to go straight to the results, in particular, starting with the effects of school closures. And interestingly, we found that 54.2% of the parents said that the national lockdown in 2020 had a detrimental effect on their children's mental health. But it was interesting to see that 45.8%, which is quite a huge slice of this sample, said that this was not the case. When we asked why, for those who responded yes, it had a detrimental effect, we found these themes that you can see on the left. So parents mentioned enhanced stress, anxiety, and emotional issues displayed by the children. Also the need for socialization, fears about COVID-19, difficulty with distanced learning, and also enhanced parental stress. For those who responded no, it actually didn't have much of an impact. They mentioned reduced stress and more emotional stability displayed by the children, but also family support, good understanding of the situation. So if the child had a functioning profile that enabled them to have a good understanding of the situation, this seemed to have a less of an impact in their mental health. And school support as an important factor as well. In terms of the impact on children's physical health, 50% of parents said yes, it had a detrimental effect, and 49.4% said no. And then we wanted to look at the predictive role of personal and demographic characteristics on these responses. So we did some regression models to look at how these variables predicted the responses. And in particular, we used the Income Deprivation Affecting Children Index, which is published by the government per local authority, to look at the effect of the socioeconomic background on these responses. And we found an effect of socioeconomic background on the impact of lockdowns on the mental health of children. So parents from the most deprived neighborhoods were significantly more likely to say that school closures affected them, very much in line with the literature that we presented as the background. And we found some effect of educational setting and gender for impact on physical health, where children in specialized settings and boys were much more likely to say that they were affected in terms of their physical health, probably because children in specialized settings require much more specialized support that, as we said, wasn't adjusted to the home environment. It wasn't possible to adjust it to the home environment. Now, when asked whether school closures during the 2020 national lockdown have had a detrimental impact on their own physical and mental health, 67.7% of the parents said yes. So there's a clear majority of the parents saying yes. There was quite a significant effect. And also parents of children from a BAME background and parents of children attending specialized settings were significantly more likely to say, yes, there was an impact on their mental health. And when we asked why, those who said yes mentioned many of the things that we have been hearing throughout the pandemic: the pressure of dealing with too many jobs, the pressure of homeschooling, the difficulty with dealing with a child's behavior needs, the lack of support or respite care, the physical toll, financial worries, sense of guilt and failure, and even some parents that mentioned depression or suicidal ideation, which was quite striking and moving, actually. For those who said no, the main reason why this was the case was due to family support, physical exercise. They've been busy with work or other projects, or they have coping mechanisms that allowed them to plow through. When looking at the effects of returning to school, 90.4% of the parents reported that their children were back at school when they filled in the survey. In terms of how satisfied they were with the social distancing measures put in place by their children's school to ensure COVID-19 safety, the majority of them rated them as pleased, mostly because we asked why in the qualitative answers, and most of them said schools did their best, but their best is actually not as good as we hoped. So this is why the majority of them said please, and then 33.7% very pleased, and only 8.4% said they were not pleased due to no using masks and lack of guidance. Also, parents of children with more than one diagnosis were more likely to lower their ratings, and 73.5% reported that going back to school had a positive effect on their children's mental health. Now, this study is published as open access in Frontiers in Special Educational Needs, so those interested can read the details further. And I've included the link on this slide. But there are two main points that I think are important for discussion and implications for practice and future research. The first one is that the majority of parents reported a detrimental effect of lockdown and staying at home, but not all of them. So as I said, there is quite a significant slice of this sample, which has been reported in other studies as well, where parents say my child was better at home. They didn't display as much anxiety, as much stress or emotional difficulties. And I think the question that this raises is, can education transform itself as a result of lessons learned from the pandemic? Because obviously we weren't responding to the needs of all the children if this was the case. So there's a lot to do in terms of communicating with parents and listening to the children's voice to make sure that we are actually addressing the individual needs of each child. And then the second point is that there is a clear effect of poverty and of being from a minority background alongside needing specialized support, and the clear role of the cumulative risk for the child and the family's well-being. So not enough has been done to advocate for the most vulnerable during the pandemic, and we should perhaps try to move away from focusing only on isolated demographic characteristics, but look at this aspect of cumulative risk, which seems to predict so much of the negative outcomes. Of course, this study has some limitations. The first that I would like to point out is that the category BAME obviously is reductionist and hides effects of particular ethnic backgrounds, which should be the focus of future research. And we did it in this way in this paper because statistically this allowed us to perform the analysis, but future research should be a lot more detailed in relation to this. And also the study is based on parental reports of children's mental and physical health, which is likely to reflect their own concerns rather than objective children's outcomes. So it would be very interesting to see similar studies, but where we actually hear from the children themselves, if possible. I've included some of the references that I've cited on this, but obviously if you have interest, you can read the whole paper on Frontiers. And this is all from me.
Thank you very much, Susanna. We're going to go over now to our final presentation. Caroline, you're up.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to share my screen here. Let me know. Can you see that okay? Hello?
Yes, we can see it.
You can see it. Right,
yeah.
Great. I'll make a start then. I think my paper will follow on really nicely, actually, from the previous papers. What we're doing here is talking about the findings of a BERA-funded small-scale project that explores the impacts of the lockdowns on the educational experiences of autistic children and their families, working with Professor Carol Vincent and Georgia Pavlopoulou. Carol, like myself, is a sociologist, so we come very much from a sociological perspective. So I'm just going to begin by outlining some of the theoretical resources that inform the project, because we know that obviously autism is a neurological condition that affects how people communicate and interact. But we come at this from a post-structuralist framework that recognises that autism is beyond a neurobiological condition alone, and emphasise really the way in which it's historically and socially contingent. And if we look at that construction, then we recognise that although there have been great strides taken by neurodiversity perspective, that sees them rather than impaired as just experiencing life in a different way. Nevertheless, autism is often interpreted as stigma. And we find that especially so in schools where young people may display behaviours which challenge social norms. However, recent considerations of the notion of stigma have suggested that this is a sort of ahistorical point of view, and actually don't pay enough attention to the ways in which stigma is produced and by whom it's produced and what ends that this serves. So we come really recognising stigma as applied to autism as a classificatory form of power, particularly building on Bourdieu's notion of symbolic power, so in other words, we're looking at the macro level forces and structures, the ways that the acts of institutions within a broader political economy act, but do so often in hidden and hidden ways, so that discrimination is structural and indirect rather than direct. And in that way, it's often misrecognized by both the people who are acting in this way, but also by those who are experiencing it. And then we also, so following on this line, we recognise, following from Grinker, that stigma is something that's embedded in modern capitalism and ideologies of individualism. So it's about those that don't fit into the expectations and the requirements of what is a sort of modern worker. And autistic children and young people along those lines can often be marked out as failing for just simply being unable to follow the expectations and requirements of regular school life. So why am I talking about this when I'm actually going to be talking about the experiences of the lockdown? Well, we follow Lupton's work, who suggests there's lots to be said about using the pandemic experience as a mirror to look at what it tells us about how things are held up in general. So what the epidemics historically have served as mirrors which hold up society, in which more general patterns of social values and attitudes appear in sharp relief. And this was certainly the case when we were doing the research with families, because they talked a lot about what was going on the rest of the time. So the pandemic was a kind of window into their regular experiences in comparison to how they were experiencing their children at home. So our study was a very small scale study. We spoke with 17 parents and 6 children. It was a rapid response to BERA's call for small grants. So we recruited via social media. And as the situation endured, we ended up then doing a follow-up survey to find out, how many, whether the kids were returning to school and this sort of thing. We very much sort of used the kind of co-design approach. We had a parent advisory panel of 3 parents and tailored our materials for the children and young people. And I'm also a mother of 3 autistic children as well. So this comes very much, it's close to my heart. Okay. Just a few notes then about our sample. We tried to go for a widespread across English regions and in terms of ethnicity, but we were limited by who responded in the very short window of time in which we sent out the call for participants. Okay, right. So I'm going to now talk about the findings, and I want to make 3 points. I'm not going to read the quotes because they're quite detailed, but do read along as I'm explaining the points. So the first point that we want to make is to ask the question, for these families, was the pandemic and the lockdown a disruption of normality or actually a familiar state? Because we found within our narratives from families that conditions of lockdown were already deeply familiar to participant families. So the pandemic's hallmarks that were causing everyone else so many issues, things like disrupted schooling and, not being able to go out and see friends, in some way was just a continuation of an already stressful pre-pandemic life that had marked them out as somehow different from others. And parents felt a kind of almost a schadenfreude, a sense of schadenfreude, that because of the pandemic that others now experience something of what they've had for a long time. And the ways that we saw that the conditions of lockdown were deeply familiar were things like the COVID labour that other studies, my colleague Catherine Twamley at Institute of Education has talked about, the COVID labour that parents have had to take on to safeguard their children's education. This was already routinely done by families, sort of monitoring what their children were doing, regular communication with school, having to be really on the ball about that. Things like the lack of spontaneity and reduced social contact. So I think this is shown in Vicky's quote here that, we have a very structured life. I know what I'm doing in 46 Thursdays time. Disrupted schooling was a common experience, as Elizabeth and Helen have already pointed out, that homeschooling is already common for SEN children, and so some children were on roll but in practice unable to attend, and this was particularly the case with Vicky's son Charlie. And others were being educated in school, but actually not within the same sites as their peers because because of anxiety and other issues. And I think there's so much attention now to children and young people's mental health issues, but this was again something that was experienced massively by the families, anxiety for their children in going to school. The second point I want to make is around misrecognition and misunderstanding of autism. That parents reported that they felt that schools interpreted their children's behaviour as choice, or that they were somehow at fault. So this showed a kind of limited understanding of neurodiversity, that sometimes the children might refuse to do something. So, in Rachel's quote here, she chose not to do the work. She's choosing not to do the work, when actually Rachel would say she can't do the work because she's anxious. And so this difference between willfulness and a child being anxious. And I think this is also really interesting in Nicole's quote here. So we see the intersections of race and disability here, because she felt very much that that she was seen as a bad mother. But the response from her son Tom was, as a black and autistic young man, was that he had to keep himself very, very contained. And this again is such a reflection of stigma, that people that you have to keep yourself down, separate or away. And I'm going to come back to this point later on. And the second point was about reluctance by some teachers to adapt provisions. This was, of course, there was a hesitancy because of the perceived cost to the school in terms of time, money, and the energy of fully accommodating autistic children, particularly given their own pressures, the demands of high stakes testing and high teacher workload, and importantly, reduced funding. And the school kind of operates as according to standardized assumptions and demands. And so parents were asking for tailored responses, and the responses that they received back was that these weren't often these couldn't always be accommodated. So there was a sort of mismatch in terms of expectations and demands going on there. So some examples being that Charlie here went to a summer school and was anxious, wouldn't go in, and so Vicky wanted one of the teachers to come out and just speak to him, and they wouldn't be, they weren't able to do that. And then my final point is about lockdown as an ambivalent release. Lockdown occasioned families staying in and away. So they were, it's about keeping people away from the school. And actually, if parents described what they were experiencing routinely as a systematic lack of recognition and response to their children's relief, then in some ways being away from that was actually offering them some release from that positioning. And so for both parents and for children, we had some really strong narratives. And this really sort of, I think, rings bells with what Susanna was talking about, was that parents and children experience this as a release from regular stresses by both children and adults, as Helen says here, always thinking the worst was going to happen, or Grace here talking about the Sunday night feeling that, oh goodness, we're going to have to jolly this child along to go to school again tomorrow. And again, this we haven't really talked very much about the children's perspectives, but this definitely comes across in how the children experience it too, because their world was safe and comfortable, and they were allowed to do some of the favorite things and engage in their special interests, for example. I have to say that it's an ambivalent release. So the point is that at the same time as there was this sense of relief from this negative positioning, they nevertheless also faced what we found as additional responsibilities to assist their children's access to schoolwork. And as several of the presentations have pointed out, there was little or no adaptation of SEN materials. And so, you know, many of the parents that we spoke to just gave up or just devised their own systems. And, you know, that might be, for example, one of the parents, Beatrice, was devising maths based on Pokemon, which was her son's special interest. But they were doing all of this additional resources, doing all this without the usual resources of families, support groups and therapists, particularly in the first lockdown. And we certainly found, and I think, you know, this rings bells again with Susanna's study, that the parents were really dragging themselves through lockdown. So, you know, the narratives were exactly pushing through or feeling hard, you know, this was hard and challenging, but you had to do it because no one else was going to do it. Just that final quote there from Gosha was that some of the parents felt that actually that just sort of chimed with their usual experience, and it just actually gave an excuse. That wasn't a common sentiment, but I think it is worth perhaps reflecting on a little bit, because of the fact that there was no adaptation of provision. Okay, so I'm going to finish now by just saying that the analysis, you know, showed it's a small sample, but really rich material, I think. And it showed that there was a huge amount of labour required to support autistic children and young people through the lockdown. And negotiate with mainstream schooling, and this is actually just a usual state of affairs. So the lockdown retreat into the private sphere of the home came as something of a relief to participant families from that marginal positioning, and it wasn't easy for families at all because of the sense of responsibility they had for their children's continued educational progress. So it was a kind of bittersweet type of relief, really. But that we found that the disruptions in educational access and progression, which were so familiar to them, so not just faced in lockdown, but also in pre-pandemic, were really felt by the families to be their problems to solve, rather than the institution failing to accommodate them. And as a result, we argue that our findings highlight the often embedded assumptions and expectations of the mainstream schooling system, particularly dominant conceptions about what it's like to be a good student, how children should study, how they respond to adults and peers. And many of the children of the families we spoke to found those to be very awkward fits within the normative expectations that constitute mainstream schooling. And even requiring reasonable adjustments, the very small things that parents mention that make a difference can be understood as a mark of deficiency or stigma in a system that emphasises individual self-responsibility, self-sufficiency, especially within recognition that making such adjustments is costly in terms of teacher time, effort and resources. So this is reflective of a broader political economy of neoliberal capitalist accumulation. So just to finish then, our data leads us, depressingly, I think, to argue that the pandemic casts a harsh light on the ordinary workings of mainstream school, which create and maintain spoiled identities for many autistic students. I'll finish there, but I'm happy to talk further about the recommendations that we came up from the project as a result. Okay, thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you very much to all our presenters before. We will now move into a time of question and answers. I have one question already for Dr. Castro Kemp, Susanna. The The question reads, it's from Sharon, and she is asking, you identify the category BAME, B-A-M-E, as reductionist and potentially problematic. Do you think that the category of vulnerable or at risk might be similarly problematic?
Thank you very much, Sharon, for your question, which is absolutely very pertinent. And I think I know where it comes from. And if you do read my research over the last 10 years, you will see that I'm very much anti-diagnosis and anti-labels. And I think that's perhaps what you mean. So I'm very much, from the point of view, my approach has always been that a child is vulnerable when the child is not participating at the level that they could be participating. However, in the literature, we have seen consistently references to children being at risk if they meet certain very vague and broad categories of risk, such as being from a deprived background, having a statutory plan, an EHC plan, for example, and at the same time, coming from a family that is somewhat unstructured, for example. So these are three very well-known risk factors. We know that statistically, children that come from settings with this cumulative risk are more likely to have less good outcomes in terms of learning and development. Now, of course, there will be exceptions. And of course, there will be other forms of vulnerability. And that's very much where I come from. We need to look at those individually. But from a point of view of policy making and decision making at the level of education policy, we need to start looking at overall risk in these terms and cumulative risk in these terms. That's what I meant when I referred to vulnerability and at risk. And this is how I think most studies refer to it in the literature. I hope this answers your question. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Susanna. We also have a question for Carolyn. Adam says that your presentation was very interesting and with implications for post-pandemic SEN teaching. Would you make any recommendations for provision for autistic students based on your findings?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a policy briefing, which I'm happy to send if I have an email to send it to. And we come up with 6 recommendations. Obviously, some of those are about recognising pupil well-being and mental health strains, and being very flexible in terms of, you know, how parents should behave and how schools should run. I think that was something that was also raised in the first presentation, Elizabeth and Helen's presentation, that, you know, there's this sort of tension about navigate around what we allow. And I found that language really interesting, actually. And I think we need to be very wary of that, particularly with autistic children and young people who are having to go back to school and, you know, be under pressure perhaps to catch up and all of these sorts of things. And, you know, perhaps some of those normative expectations about how pupils should behave might even become, you know, even stronger. So we need to be aware about that. And I think reconsidering about what makes a good learning environment for autistic children and young people. Many of the support services, so things like the nurture spaces, were quickly dispensed with during the pandemic because of, you know, bubbles or whatever. But on the other hand, some of the transparency and simplicity of COVID-safe schools was actually really beneficial. So only having, for example, one parent come to school sports day was seen as brilliant for some of the autistic children who found those big school events really hard. I'll finish because I'm sure there's other questions as well, but I think it's also about, you know, making sure that those recovery plans are suitable. So things like, you know, expecting children to come in for more, you know, after school tutoring, or, you know, in the past, the large holiday play schemes, that might not be appropriate. And then I think, you know, just finally, that it's about how this can be supported at a school level. We found, you know, that that there were often, you know, a few teachers who took responsibility for this. And actually we're looking for complete inclusion that would extend to a whole school culture of knowledge for staff and students. So, but I'm happy to send the full briefing if I have an email to send it to.
Or you could share a link and we could put it in the
I'll just put the link in, but I've only got access to a private chat at the moment. So
yeah, you place it in the private chat and I'll put it over.
Brilliant, thanks.
All right, so we don't have any more questions as yet. So I'd also open it up to the panelists if you have any questions of your colleagues.
May I?
Go ahead.
Okay, I actually asked, and that question was to Caroline. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Caroline, your research was on autistic children. I want to know to what extent did parents' assistance necessary for autistic children, especially those who were younger, because our research indicated that the younger children had far more issues with the online and the special needs children.
So sorry, just to clarify, is that the question about how children are involved in research? It's breaking up a little bit, so I can't hear too well.
Okay, I was asking to what extent the parents had to be involved in assisting like the autistic children, especially the younger ones, because from our research we found that while the older children, you know, manage the online relatively well, the physically, you know, challenged children, including autistic, had major problems managing online on their own.
Yeah. I mean, I should say that we aimed for children over 10 for that reason, to make the distinction, but we ended up just by sort of necessity having a few children in that were younger. But most of our sample were with the older children. And actually, to be honest, with the autistic students, it wasn't necessarily the older ones, it wasn't necessarily the case that was any easier. I mean, the amount of monitoring that needed to go on with parents, you know, or trying to encourage them to take part and them finding it too much. On the other hand, it was mixed. I'd have to look at that in more detail, because some of the students really liked it and they got on really well. It was very clear. It was all laid out on Google Classroom, so they had their tasks to work through. Yeah, I mean, as I say, most of our sample was for older children. So, yeah. Okay. I don't know if I answered that very well, but
I guess my feeling is that unless the sort of, however idealistic, you know, unless the priorities of the educational system change, you know, I think that's probably going to be a common situation that you encountered, Caroline, you know, particularly with reference to autism. Our fear with the offering research was precisely your type of finding would be used to legitimize exclusionary practices. You know, I totally agree with you. There's so much to be learned from that experience. But for me, the implication is the system, there has to be, you know, systemic change.
Yeah.
And given the neoliberal, you know, performative pressures, who could be confident that that's going to happen? Could I just come back on the question about terminology? And from my point of view, the language of special educational needs is problematic, you know, highly problematic. And again, I think these are things that have to be addressed. Okay.
Okay. All right. So we also have Susanna sharing some information here that the Special Education Frontiers in Education Special Education Needs is issuing a call for papers on inclusion and special needs. So I've shared that information in the chat with our participants at your request,
Okay.
Susanna.
Okay.
So we have about 19 minutes to go. I don't see any more questions coming in, so we could continue the discussion. Amongst our panelists, any other questions there? We have 8 viewers in our session.
Okay, I guess that's it.
Okay.
Today.
Well, it seems that way. I want to then at this point in time thank everyone for participating in this session. Thank you to our participants that joined in and listened to what it is that we had to share in terms of our different research. And thank you too to our panelists for sharing your information with us. It was very useful, and we truly appreciate your time this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're located.
Thank you for sharing,
That's right.
Tanisha.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it was lovely to meet you all, and I'll certainly be following up. Do you think that we could share our presentations? Because I'd really like to, draw on some of your research.
Sure. We could actually share our email addresses, and we could pass that
We
information
have each
on
other's
to you.
email addresses, don't we?
Yes,
Yeah.
we
Oh,
will.
yes, we
Yes,
do.
we do on the platform.
Yeah.
So I think that would be really nice.
Additionally, for those who receive the bearer small grant funding, like us, for example, there is the publication online in the bearers thing as well.
So you can check
again,
the
we want
Bearer
to thank
platform
them
as
both.
well. Yeah.
Yes.
Were the other? So Susanna, was yours bearer funded as well, or
No.
No.
Oh,
Okay.
The,
But I'll be happy to share my slides and the paper if you wish.
Yes.
We can
Yes.
communicate by email.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very nice.
Yes.
that would be great.
Let me do one last check to see if there are any more questions. Okay, so we have Tanya saying it has been very interesting. Thank you. Long days though, so processing, slowing down for questions. It seems that way, Tanya.
I think we all feel like that.
For all the technical glitches, that wasn't awfully helpful, but thank you for bearing with us.
Yes.
Yeah. We are hoping that before long, this COVID virus and the new variant, whatever, will be on its way so that we can really meet face to face. I can't remember seeing any of these faces when I was at the last Bearer conference back in 2019?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, in the UK there, Manchester. So I'm looking forward to meeting everybody face to face. Tanisha and I, and our colleague Vanessa Ellis-Colley, who actually she's doing some data collection, and this was the only time she got to interview a principal, a dean of a school. So she was really unavoidably absent.
All right. So once again, thank you, everyone. And I'll turn over to our person in the background there as we head out of our session today.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.